Welcome everyone to the YP webinar, Edelman Trust Barometer, featuring Jennifer Cohan. Jennifer Cohan is president of Edelman, New York, the firm's largest office. She advises clients, develops new services, and leads a group of professionals who evolve, promote, and protect many of the world's most influential companies and brands. Under her leadership, Edelman, New York has built upon its media heritage to include communications and marketing and corporate advisory services. Jennifer creates measurable brand and reputational programs in the financial services, food, health, personal care, and technology sectors. Jennifer is a particular expert at building campaigns rooted in purpose and expressed across multiple channels and audiences. She's a frequent speaker on trust and brand loyalty, and her work has been recognized with Cohan Titanium and Gold Lions, PR Week, and The One Show. Jennifer is a graduate of Kenyon College and New York University and serves on the boards of Friends of Hudson River Park and Partnership for the Homeless. She's worked and traveled throughout the world. We are so lucky to have Jennifer presenting to us today. After her presentation, we will start with a moderated Q&A and then open it up to live questions. Please use the chat function on the Zoom to submit questions throughout the presentation. As always, I would encourage everyone to share the ABNY message through social media at ABNY. Without further ado, here's Jennifer. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Sarah. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Edelman has been studying trust for the last 20 years. We started this study in 2000. Our CEO, Richard Edelman, was attending the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. And back in 2000, it was a time of hope and prosperity in the country. The Cold War had ended. A lot of countries were drawing down military spending. The internet was still fairly new, and there was widespread economic expansion. So sort of all of the ingredients for an environment where there would be a high degree of satisfaction. But those of you who recall back 20 years ago to that WTO meeting, it became known as the Battle for Seattle. And it was because there were large and very, very violent protests that were happening. And our CEO, Richard, sort of was thinking about it, was wondering what was behind all of that, given what was happening in the world at large, and had a theory that there was a deficit of trust. And so began examining trust in institutions. And we've been studying that trust every year for the past 20 years. Oh dear. So every year we conduct the Trust Barometer in countries around the world, and we gauge trust in four institutions: business, government, NGOs, and media. And we really segregate, if you will, the audience with whom we evaluate into two groups. One is a group that we call the informed public, and that's about 15% of the people that we survey. And the criteria that they meet is that they are have four-year college education or the equivalent in their country, that they have an income that puts them in the higher brackets. In this country, it's $75,000 or above, and again, similar in the country that we're surveying. And importantly, is that these people are also consumers of professionally produced media, general interest, business, and public affairs media. And as I mentioned, that group represents 15% of the respondents. And then the rest of the respondents, we classify as mass population, and that is sort of, to put it indelicately, everybody else. We conduct the Trust Barometer battery of questions every November, and we release them as part of the World Economic Forum the following January. Throughout the year, we will conduct special supplemental studies, usually around a key topic area, such as trust in brands, or against a specific audience, such as investor trust. Since the emergence of the coronavirus, we've conducted a few supplemental studies that really probe into the expectation of different audiences related to the virus. And what I'm going to share with you today is the most expansive of those studies, which we released just under 2 weeks ago, and was conducted in 11 countries. You can see on the left side of the screen which they were. I'll share with you some highlights from around the world and really punctuate US data, and in some cases relate US data to data from around the world as well. So in studying trust over the last 10 years or so, what we've seen is a dynamic where business has largely been what we call the last retaining wall of trust. And I'll give you a little bit of context for that. During the Great Recession and immediately following it, we saw a decline in trust in business. And probably not surprising to each of you on this call, that the public believed that business and sort of the greed of business and the relentless march to make money in business really led to the economic conditions of the Great Recession. But what we saw starting in about 2012 and through 2016 in particular is that the trust in business started to rise. And we saw that trust in government really fell. And this happened for a few reasons, not the least of which was that in this country and some other countries, people felt that the government didn't really hold anybody responsible for all of the pain and suffering of the Great Recession. That business sort of marched on with its usual pace while regular people were losing their homes and losing their jobs, and so on and so forth. That was coupled with businesses acting with a greater sense of purpose, as well as an economic recovery where there was greater job stability and small increases in wages, and we started to see trust in business rise. The other piece of backdrop that's important is that we've seen a consistent fall in trust in media. That is largely driven by distrust in social media and content in social media, with a real acceleration around 2016, which you'll recall is when sort of the term fake news entered the lexicon, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and similar ones in other parts of the world, that really punctuated distrust in social media. So what you can see here on this slide, and somewhat to our surprise, when we conducted this study a few weeks ago, we found that trust in each of the four institutions that we measure, business, government, media, and NGOs, had risen to all-time highs. Interestingly enough, government was the institution in this country and around the world in which trust accelerated the most. Now you can see indicated by this red square on the chart reflecting government trust that it still is beneath 50%. But we have seen an acceleration, and in a few minutes I'll unpack for you exactly where that's coming from, because you'll likely be surprised that trust in government is rising. Similarly, trust in the other institutions you can see is rising as well, and I'll give you a little bit of the dynamics and some of the watch-outs regarding this trust. Really starting with the belief that we have based on data from previous studies that we're we're experiencing a bit of a trust bubble. What we've seen in other parts of the world where there have been very dramatic rises in trust is that it almost is reflective of sort of a wartime mentality, or because there's been a very signal event that has propelled trust forward. And just as easily as it inflates, it can deflate as well. And we think that that's really the very likely scenario for the levels of trust and the increases that I just shared with you, given some of the underlying strains in the system and fears that people have, that if government and business in particular don't address those, we're going to see trust decelerate quite rapidly. So let me share a little bit of data behind all of that. We asked people a battery of questions related to how effectively government and business were keeping people safe economically as well as from a health standpoint. And what you can see on this slide is that uh, only a third of people in the US believe that the government is doing a good enough job to provide the supplies and the treatment across the board for all Americans. Similarly, only half of people believe that business is implementing the right safety measures to protect their employees and their customers. And I'll pause on this one for a moment because what we know is that a lot of organizations, whether they have workforces that are completely at home, like many of you, or they've got workforces that are either on the front lines in manufacturing, in retail, in logistics, and a combination of an at-home workforce, is that many people just don't know what companies are doing. And you're going to hear that theme throughout, is that there's a lot of good work that business in particular is doing to come to the aid of employees and to the greater public, but that it's just not well enough known. And I'll point to some of those as I continue through. The other thing that won't come as a big surprise to you is that people are very, very worried about their economic future and their employment future. In particular, back in January, when we conducted our sort of main trust study, we found that just over three quarters of people told us that they worried about losing their jobs due to factors such as automation or immigration or the gig economy. What we're seeing now is that just over half of people are very worried about losing their jobs due to the pandemic. And importantly, not being able to find a new job for a very long time. And that is pretty consistent across demographic groups and our informed public, as well as people who we call the mass population. Similarly, that people are very concerned about the reliability of news and information related to safety, as well as related to the economic impact of the virus. You can see again on the left here that about 2/3 of people tell us that they worry about fake news and false information about the virus and everything associated with it. And in the US, about half of people tell us that it's difficult for them to find reliable and trustworthy information. And the reasons that this is so important is probably abundantly clear to all of you, which is that that's helping people, people are finding it hard to make good decisions and know what they should and should not be doing in terms of their own behavior. Back again in January, when we released our first trust barometer, there was a quite stunning statistic that 56% of Americans told us that capitalism in its current form, and I underline the phrase "in its current form," was no longer working. And we've seen that accelerate and punctuated by the coronavirus. You can see here that over 50%, 60% of people said that the virus has made them realize just how big the gaps in this country are between various classes of people, and that something must be done to more fairly distribute opportunity and prosperity. Similarly, 2/3 of people tell us that people with less education and fewer resources are being overly burdened with keeping our country afloat and with having risk of illness and death and sacrifice due to the virus. Now, I mentioned a few moments ago that trust in government had risen more quickly than any of our other institutions that we measure. And I just want to take you through a little bit of the data on what's behind that, because it might have come as a surprise to you. Back again when we conducted our trust barometer in January, trust in all institutions was only 47% of people, and now we're at about 53. Government is still distrusted in the US, as I had mentioned before, but this is where this gets kind of juicy and interesting, is that in the United States, we see big gaps in the level of trust in a federal or central government. Obviously, in our case, that means the administration, but it also means Congress. You see that only 46% of people trust a central or federal government in this country, where 66 or 2/3 of people trust local and state governments. People are really believing what their local officials are telling them. Local officials have been very candid in how they've spoken. We've certainly seen that here in New York, and very frequent in their communications. You won't also be terribly surprised to know that there are pretty significant political divides. We asked people to tell us how they intended to vote in November, Republican or Democrat. You can see here that there is a pretty big deficit between what Democrats or blue voters, how much they trust the federal government, versus Republican voters as well. So there is a lot of dimension in terms of trust, whether it be from a local to federal or from a party affiliation. Now, I think that one of the really interesting findings, and why so much of this matters, both from a government standpoint and a business standpoint, is what people believe is necessary for them to stay safe. And we asked a battery of questions to understand how much people would be willing to restrict their movements or to compromise, if you will, some of their privacy and some of their data in exchange for feeling or being more safe. And what you can see here is that 3/4 of people said that they believed that it was appropriate and reasonable for restriction on freedom of movement. That is obviously freedom of movement that is initiated by government, but also from business. For those of you who are working for companies that are starting to reopen, this is a really important consideration as you think about how you earn the trust of people to come back to business. And similarly, a very analogous data point in that people are also willing to give up more of their personal health and location data, things that they've not traditionally been willing to do to government or to employees, again, in exchange for their safety and the safety around them, of those around them. I'll very quickly touch on the role of media and NGOs. I've obviously focused considerably on business and government. In an environment where people don't trust a lot of news and they believe that it's fake news and that largely that is driven by social media, people are pretty sophisticated about its sources, even if they don't know what to believe, is that we continue to see an acceleration of trust in traditional media. And by traditional media, we mean professionally produced journalism. You won't be surprised to know that people trust that media which they consume. And that there are, of course, as with many things in this country, that there are political divides on that, so that if you consume Fox media, you tend to trust more conservative media. Similarly, if you're an MSNBC viewer, you tend to trust more liberal media. But having said all of that, even with people trusting the media that they consume, they also believe that media is too biased politically and too often is advocating a political point of view. In terms of who people trust in order to tell the truth about the pandemic, it's the people who are really on the front lines, who are believed to have an unbiased view. So you can see scientists, doctors, health experts. And then very quickly coming after that is the CEO of somebody's own company. Over the last few years, we've seen a very, very significant deepening of trust in people's own employer. In fact, just about 80% of people tell us that they trust their own employer, and that's the most trusted relationship that people have of all of those that we examine. I mentioned unbiased journalism, that people believe that journalists are still advocating a little bit more point of view and advocating for political positions in their reporting on the pandemic and its effect. Similarly, we've seen trust in NGOs across the world and also in the United States. You might be surprised that in some cases NGOs are seen as neutral versus trusted. What's behind that is that many people believe that the problems that the world is facing are so significant that NGOs aren't equipped to solve them by themselves. And usually that's a matter of scale or financing. In some parts of the world, there are lower degrees of trust in NGOs, and that's because of some of the funding issues and some of the behavioral issues that have happened in some other parts of the world. So look, this is a moment of reckoning for business. I mentioned earlier that trust is increasing in each of our institutions, or that it hasn't increased, but that it's a very tenuous hold. So I just want to take you through a few data points and points of guidance for business specifically. While people trust their employers quite significantly, and as you saw me mention a moment ago, that their CEOs are trusted, people believe that CEOs writ large should be taking more of a leadership role in addressing the pandemic publicly. And that's particularly important as we're going to get to that moment of truth with return to work and return to commerce. People don't believe that CEOs should wait for government to impose restrictions or to mandate change, that CEOs should take sort of the pulpit that they have and the platform that they have to run with it. But people don't think that CEOs are doing a good enough job in terms of doing this. And the reason for it is that there are not enough visible CEOs who are advocating for positive change, or who are out there publicly talking about the change that they are initiating in their own companies. In fact, one of our colleagues did a little bit of desk research to see how many CEOs had published op-eds since the beginning of the pandemic, and the number was a resounding 1. So a real opportunity. Similarly, people don't see a lot of the really good work that companies are doing, whether it be manufacturing products and services that people need to address the pandemic, protecting essential employees whose jobs really require them to be on the front lines, and similarly, preparing for a recovery that accommodates our need to be safe with our need to reignite the economy. I'll just sort of keep pointing at some of these statistics because they're interesting. Similarly, just over a third of people only believe that companies are doing a good job of protecting their employees' financial well-being, or those stakeholders within their larger universe. And to put a really fine point on it, it is not so much that companies aren't doing this, it's that they're not being visible in how they do that. So look, business has got to be part of the fight against the pandemic. It's been doing it quite well, but isn't getting as much credit. And people really need business to step up to the plate, to partner with government, to partner with NGOs, to collaborate in solving some of these problems. What we find is that trust in each institution rises when they collaborate with other institutions to solve problems. So one is that people believe that CEOs really need to take a leadership position in what return to work looks like, and that they should be very conservative in what normal operations look like. More than three quarters of people told us their expectation. Similarly, 2/3 of people said that government's highest priority in partnership with business must be saving lives and keeping people safe, even if it means suffering more economic consequence. And lastly, I'll mention is in all of the quite dire statistics that I gave you, and quite sobering data, is that there's some real glimmers of hope, and around the world in this country, a real signal that sort of American ingenuity is going to really rise to the occasion when we're able to, which is that when we asked people whether they thought that there was going to be innovation or building back better, you can see that around the world, 2/3 of people told us that they believed that this would happen. In the US, was right in the thick of that, with, again, about 2/3 of people telling us that they thought that there were going to be some valuable innovations in terms of products and services, in terms of ways of working, in terms of policy, and some changes that will make our post-COVID lives better than the ones that we entered into the virus with. So in conclusion, there are just a few things that I think important to keep in mind. One is that business and government must take tangible action to preserve trust for the long term, so that this is not just a trust bubble. That trust is built when institutions collaborate. None of them can do it on their own. And in this particular situation, business and government in particular must really be those key collaborators and partners in solution. Business must live up to its multi-stakeholder promise. All of you will certainly know the pronouncement that came from the Business Roundtable about 9 or 10 months ago. This is a moment for business to prove it and to really ask itself what it will be remembered for doing during the pandemic, amongst its employees, amongst its suppliers, amongst its customers, and amongst society as a whole, as well as policymakers. I talked at length about CEOs demonstrating public leadership and not just facing inward, but facing outward as well. The other reason to do this is to inspire others to do the same. And what we'll really see is that the next crucible moment in New York, around the country, and around the world is that as we return to work and as we return to commerce, is that this is going to be a real test of trust in the institutions. So with that, thank you for allowing us to share our insights with you. I think there were a few people who had a few questions that I'm very happy to answer, and also mention that